All right, we're moving into chapter 4, the book of Leviticus, and we'll just be exploring some of the content, themes, and connections that the book of Leviticus has overall and how it reaches into things beyond itself, whether it be elsewhere in the Old Testament or into the New Testament. All right, so we're going to start off with just talking about the content of Leviticus. And primarily, everyone is going to agree that Leviticus is focused on the holiness of God. And specifically, the holiness that should be in the community of God because it represents God on earth. So, the famous statement, "Be holy because I am holy," is found here in Leviticus. So, as Longman is going to argue, all of the Levitical regulations reflect the absolute otherness or holiness of God. And I guess I'll talk about that some as well. Holiness is not just being set apart, that's the normal sort of definition. Instead, it signifies being set apart unto the greatness or the otherness of God. And I've found one scholar that I think articulates this very well. This is in the book Discovering Isaiah by Andrew T. Abernathy. So he says, "What does holiness mean?" And he's reflecting on Isaiah chapter 6, verse 3: "The holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory." So he says, what does holiness, kadosh, mean? Why is it listed 3 times? In my experience with churchgoers, a popular definition of holy is to be set apart. The problem with this definition is that it can leave God out of the equation. I can set a basketball apart from other basketballs, but that does not make it holy. You can isolate yourself from the entire world, but that does not make you or anyone else holy. I could describe a student as set apart, but this does not mean that I think he or she is holy. Holiness belongs exclusively to God, as it expresses God's distinctness from all that is not God. Anything other than God that is said to be holy is so because its holiness stems from being associated with God. So, once again, God is the other, and we are, in a sense, setting ourselves apart to be embracing Him when we are striving to be holy. So, from here, Leviticus is also going to be the place where we have the main sort of access to the sacrificial system and an explanation of the sacrificial system. So, we've had sacrifices happen, like with Noah and Abraham and all of that so far in the Pentateuch, but we've not yet had an explanation of how these sacrifices are supposed to work or what they're supposed to do. So overall, there are 5 sacrifices and offerings that are used to reconcile and restore the worshiper with Yahweh and or with other worshipers, and these are all described in the book of Leviticus. So the first one is going to be the burnt offering. So this burnt offering is described as this because it's the only one that's burnt up entirely. It's an expiation for the sins that are committed by the worshiper, and they're going to burn this entirely to the Lord. And one of the quick things that's worth mentioning about this sort of sacrifice is that you're taking something that you would normally have eaten, something you would normally would have used to survive, and you're saying, I'm going to, in a sense, fast from this. I'm going to do without this in order to make sure that I'm demonstrating to myself, first and foremost, because you're actually doing the sacrifice, and as in a sort of heartfelt sense of reliance on God by saying, I'm going to burn all of this because I'm going to be provided by God, my Father, not by the means of which I've sort of acquired these sort of things. If I'm going to need more cattle, God is going to bring more cattle. If I'm going to need more grain or whatever it is, God's going to bring more grain to me. And so I'm not going to have to just solely rely on this. I'm the one who committed a sin, which is the reason why we don't have abundance to begin with. So now I'm going to be giving up that which I do have so that I can continue to rely on God and acknowledge this sort of sin in hopes that He's going to cover me. So from here, you get the grain offering. And this was somewhat of a substitute for the burnt offering in the case where you were somewhat of a poorer citizen and you needed something else other than an animal that you would be able to sacrifice to God. So instead, you would give a grain offering because that would have just been in more of abundance for them to have had access to. Then you get the fellowship slash peace offering. This offering focused on reconciliation between God and the community, and it was often associated or connected to a vow that was made or some sort of celebration that was going to be had at the time. Ultimately, this offering was about, once again, fellowship and reconciliation. Then you have the sin offering, which was for unintentional sins. Um, this particular offering was also different in that it is the only one that was actually smeared directly on the altars. So the other offerings, the burnt offering, peace offering slash fellowship offering, and the next one we're going to talk about, the guilt offering, all of those were poured on the sides of the altar. But in this particular case, the blood was actually smeared directly on the altar, and it was sprinkled inside of the tent. And so that's one of the unique things about here. But once again, it was for any sort of unintentional sins. So that could range from something you forgot, some sort of mistake that you committed, or even something that was offered after childbirth, skin disease, or even for the ordination of priest. And so then lastly, you have the guilt offering. So the guilt offering was for the most grievous of sins. And so it required this sort of extra 20% or 1/5 that you would put on top of it. So I'm going to read here from you from Hubbard and Dearman's Introduction to the Old Testament. They're going to say the restitution offering, the asham, guilt offering, is the most difficult of the five to define and to distinguish between the purification offering, also known as the sin offering. The restitution offering deals with forms of impurity, while the later imposes monetary penalties for profane usage of sacred objects. So the idea here would be the sin offering would be for unintentional sins, versus the guilt offering would be for worse sort of things, and or if you did something that interrupted sort of the holy items or the holy relics related to worship in the community and things of that nature. It's also worth noting that the guilt offering exclusively had rams that needed to be offered, compared to the sin offering could be a cattle or any other sort of animal being brought. You had to bring a ram for the guilt offering. So this chart here is from Wenham's Exploring the Old Testament textbook. And I just liked how he had this chart together. So once again, the burnt offering, you could bring cattle, sheep, goats, or birds. Peace offering, cattle, sheep. The sin offering, cattle, sheep, goats, or rams. But then the guilt offering, or goats or birds, sorry. And then the guilt offering, only rams. You would lay your hand on all of the animals, probably in the guilt offering, but it's not very clear. The thing that makes the sin offering unique is that you're smearing the blood on the altar instead of pouring it on the sides. The thing that makes the burnt offering unique is that it has no priestly portions. And the thing that makes the peace offering unique, it was the only one where the lay people could also participate in the sacrifice. So with the fellowship or the peace offering, you would participate in it as well when you brought the offering. You'd get to eat some of the offering as if you were at a fellowship table or the table of the Lamb in some way or shape or form of saying that like you were eating with God as well as with the priest, and it was a sort of fellowship compared to the rest of them. The priest would only have portions, and the lay people would have no portions. But even with the burnt offering, which was the most common of the offerings, even the priest would not have had a portion of that. So it's also worth talking about the festivals very quickly. These are each found in Leviticus chapter 23, at least for their overview of their descriptions. And each of them occurs at a certain time of the year in the sort of quote unquote lunar or Jewish calendar. So the first one here, you have Passover, also known as Pesach, which would be at the first of the month on the 14th through the 21st of that month. Then you would have the Feast of Weeks, also known as Shavuot, and that would take place in the third month on the first day. Then you've got the Feast of Trumpets, also known as Rosh Hashanah, and that would be one that would take place in the seventh month. You got the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, that taking place on the 10th day of the seventh month. And then you have the Feast of Booths or Sukkot, and that would take place between the 15th and the 22nd of the seventh month. And the thing that Wyndham is going to emphasize here, and I think correctly, is that the seventh month is obviously the most important one because it's the one that has the most amount of festivals taking place. So just like the Sabbath or Sabbat is the most holiest day of the week, you're going to have the seventh month being the most holiest month of the year. So you can further dissect the content of Leviticus in talking about three main sort of things. First, it's focused on the priesthood. It's where you get all of the descriptions about what the priests need to do and how they need to do their sacrifices, how they need to actually make things holy, how they need to orchestrate how they're going to be around the community of Israel. And that's why a lot of people are going to associate Leviticus with the quote unquote P source for the JEDP documentary hypothesis. Then you have to focus on purity, because once again, it's going to be focused on the people being holy like God is holy. And so it's going to talk through how you can be ritually pure and give you the prerequisites for how you can take part in a covenant relationship. And the last thing is just the general sort of holiness code, which is going to refer to manners in which you need to conduct yourself in a certain way when you're dealing with your neighbors, foreigners, widows, and the poor. So those three things can kind of culminate the main sort of ideas being focused on in Leviticus: priesthood, purity, and a holiness code. So overall, nothing new here about authorship or date. Like Longman is going to say here, the context has the Israelite tribes in the wilderness receiving the sacrificial and ritual purity instructions from Yahweh via Moses. The events cover a period of 1 month in most chronologies of how people are going to deal with the book of Leviticus. But then, once again, however you view the author of Genesis is going to relate to how you view the entire author of the Pentateuch. There is no indication that the Levitical book in and of itself was ever read in isolation from the rest of the Pentateuch. It was always used in conjunction with the other 4 books to make the 5 books together. So once again, how you view authorship on one is going to affect how you view authorship on all of them. All right, so if you're going to break down the genre or the units in Leviticus, you have a very clear holiness code section from Leviticus 17 through 27. But then you also have some other discrete units. So the book begins with the sacrificial laws. Then you get a section on the priest and how you become a priest and how you need to stay a priest. Then you have another section on ritual laws. And then the HC or holiness code is kind of the culmination of it in some ways, as most scholars would talk about the book of Leviticus, that is kind of building up to that sort of holiness code. And some people would even argue that's the center of the Pentateuch itself, which is a discussion we may have later in the semester. And then from there, Longman is just going to point out that Leviticus is a bridge between Exodus and Numbers, and that Exodus was kind of ending off with these sort of laws and talking about sacrifices and things that you needed to do. And now Leviticus is going to step in and give you the breakdown of those. And Numbers is going to just demonstrate Israel's lack of obedience to the covenant stipulations as they continued on their journey through the wilderness. So Longman is going to connect this to Christ by saying all of the legal, civil, ritual, cultic instructions that are in Leviticus are consummated in the law of Christ. And I would even go so far as to argue that when we see the phrase the law of Christ in the New Testament, the idea is that we would be living out the heart of what we find in the book of Leviticus. And once again, that'll be a discussion we can perhaps have later in the semester. And so at the end of the day, this is going to relate to the first and greatest commandment, which is to love God with your soul, mind, and being with all that you are, and to love your neighbor as yourself. Well, if you were doing the heart of what's in Leviticus, not necessarily the exact practices, but the heart of what the book of Leviticus is teaching, then you're going to actually be fulfilling those two laws and fulfilling the greatest commandment. From here, he's also going to point out that the book of Hebrews deals with the priestly and sacrificial concepts that are related to the person and the work of Christ, specifically in Hebrews chapter 9, verse 26, which reads, "Since it would have been necessary for him to suffer many times from the foundation of the world, but now he has appeared once at the end of the ages for the removal of sin by the sacrifice of himself." So the idea being is this is giving us a good enough background to understand that there are these 5 categories and 5 different sorts of sacrifices that we would need to get our grip on, and that all of these Christ is going to intentionally have a sacrifice that can cover all of those for us, such that they would no longer be necessary in the long run for how we would live and when it comes to our faith and practice before God.